Hello and welcome to the Law with Charlie YouTube channel. I'm Charlie Medcalf, and today I'm going to be talking about something which has been very recent and is very important, I'd say. It's Labour's recent U-turn when it comes to day one unfair dismissal rights. And so let's just start from the basics. We have many employment rights, but there are limits to those rights to ensure there's a balance between the fairness of the employer and the employee. Labour are currently working on an employment rights bill which will update the current legislation and hopefully try and achieve a fairer balance. And so one of the biggest things which they were suggesting was a day one right to various rights. But Labour has officially U-turned on one of its biggest employment law promises, and that is giving workers the right to claim unfair dismissal from day one of their job. And so when it comes to the law of unfair dismissal, if your employer dismisses you for a potentially unfair reason, it means you potentially have a right to claim, go to the employment tribunal and claim for compensation essentially for that unfair dismissal. And under the current law, the Employment Rights Act 1996, I think it is, there's currently a 2-year qualifying period, so you must work with your employer for 2 years before you can rely on these employment rights. So let's go straight back to what was actually promised. So during the last general election, Labour promised 3 main things: day one rights for parental leave, day one sick pay, and day one protection from unfair dismissal, all of which are currently under a qualifying period of 2 years. And so what Labour would have done is made these rights which someone can access from the first day of their employment. And it was a central part of their employment rights bill. So essentially, what happens now? Why did they come to this? So, as you can imagine, there was lots of criticism from businesses who were not up for this idea, including resistance in the House of Lords. This is because these employment rights legislation, it can be a pain for employers. It can limit what employers do, and essentially employment is governed by a contract, and the basic principles of contract law says the two parties should be free to negotiate and action their contract as they think fit, and the law or the state should not interfere unduly when it comes to contracts. And essentially what happens with these employment rights is it limits how the employer can enact, enforce, or use their contract. However, many would argue that there's actually imbalance of bargaining powers, so it's unlikely that the employee or the person applying for the job is going to try and negotiate the terms of the contract, especially in the current climate with the cost of living crisis. It's much more likely that individuals will just take their employment contract as it is. And so that's one of the reasons why there may be a bit of debate. But workers will instead gain this right after 6 months. So that's essentially what they have changed. So rather than it being the current 2 years, rather than it being a day one right, it's going to be 6 months. And I will go into why that's a much better time period, at least in my opinion, in a moment. But why the U-turn? The government essentially says this is a pragmatic compromise between trade unions and businesses, so trying to balance the rights between different parties, the trade unions who represent the employees and the employers or businesses who have legitimate business aims to achieve. But it's also necessary to unblock the bill in Parliament. Now this point goes into constitutional law, which I will not cover today, but I imagine that for the Labour government, it's more important that they get this bill enacted into an Act of Parliament so employees can start relying on it. But also, there's a very real concern that if it was a day one right, it would essentially lead to tribunals and being backlogged, being overworked, and so making it a 6-month right instead will help prevent overwhelming the tribunal system. But also, it reassures employers who were warned that day one rights would discourage hiring, because you need to know, are you going to work well with this person? Because there might just be a personality clash, which might mean that actually, no, they are not fit to be working here. So, who actually supports these U-turns? It's largely business groups who are really delighted, because firms were extremely worried that it would limit their freedom, and then hiring would stall because of the day one proposal, and the government would have the right, the government has now put the right most concerned part of the bill. So several unions also accepted the compromise, but who actually opposes it? So mainly it's the Labour MPs and some of the unions, particularly Unite. Unite the union calls it very humiliating and damaging betrayal, especially when it was a Labour manifesto commitment. And that causes all sorts of constitutional problems when it does break a manifesto promise. But critics also claim that Labour is essentially bowing to business pressure and watering down workers' rights, which is not very good, because that just shows how there's still a significant imbalance of bargaining power, meaning actually employees are probably worse off than the employers. Despite this though, day one sick pay and paternity leave are still going to be in force, and they should hopefully be arriving in around April 2026, so April next year with a bit of luck. But then the main difference is when it comes to the unfair dismissal qualifying period, it will be 6 months now rather than day one right, but we do not know exactly when this will come into force. But also, under this new employment rights bill, they intend to set up a Fair Work agency in 2026. And now that they have sorted out this difference, the government hope that they can get this bill through Parliament the rest of the way without further blockage, and to enact it in order to give employees the rights they deserve. But why is a day one right as a qualifying period so problematic in general, but particularly in relation to unfair dismissal? As we've seen, it will lead to tribunals being overwhelmed, so anyone with any knowledge of the legal system will know that it's not doing very well because of a lack of resources, lack of funding, and essentially many delays both in the courts and the tribunals. And so reducing the qualifying period would mean that those delays would grow and grow, and that's not good for our justice system at all. Obviously that links into bigger problems, but largely we need to make sure that we do not put too much more pressure on the system we already have. Also, if there was a day one right, it's likely that individuals would abuse the process, and so that is something else we should also avoid, and this is according to an employment solicitor I've previously spoken to. And so we need to stop individuals from abusing the process, but also, even as it has been with the 2-year qualifying period, people are getting around the qualifying period, for instance through a discrimination claim, which is a day one right as it currently is. And so essentially this change to 6 months, I imagine, at least in my view, and I think I'm joined by many employment lawyers and academics, is that this is the right move, and it's actually going to be better than a day one right for many different reasons, such as those I've been through today. So, as a takeaway, Labour has abandoned its promise for a day one unfair dismissal rights, and they have instead replaced it with a 6-month qualifying period to secure business support and get its wider employment reformed through Parliament, meaning that employees can start benefiting from these new employment rights much quicker. And this is a change which I very much welcome. But please do let me know what you think of this change in the comments section below, remembering to like, comment and subscribe to this channel for more content just like this. I wish you all a good day, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.